20 years ago, I found a Bigfoot infant crying in a cave in the Oregon Cascades, and I raised it until it was ready to return to the wild. This is the story of how it happened, and why I can never tell anyone else but you. It was late afternoon on March 14th, 2003, and I was hiking a trail I'd walked 100 times before in the remote Oregon Cascades. The weather was perfect, clear skies, temperature in the low 50s, just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. I'd been hiking since dawn, following my usual route through the dense pine forest that stretches for miles without a single road or building. I love these mountains because you could walk for days without seeing another person. That afternoon, I was about 8 miles from my truck, planning to loop back before sunset, when I heard something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a crying sound echoing off the mountainside from somewhere above me. At first I thought it might be a bird, maybe an eagle or hawk, but the more I listened, the less sense that made. It wasn't a bear cub. I'd heard plenty of those, and they sound different, more grunting and huffing. It wasn't a mountain lion kitten either, which have this distinctive high-pitched scream. This was something else entirely, something that made the hair on my neck stand up. It sounded almost like a human baby, but deeper somehow, more resonant. The cry echoed through the trees with this desperate, pleading quality that pulled at something deep in my chest. I tried to keep walking, told myself it was just some animal I wasn't familiar with, but the sound followed me. It grew more desperate and weak as I moved away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in serious trouble up there. I don't have kids of my own, never wanted them really, but something about those cries triggered this parental instinct I didn't know I had. After about 10 minutes of trying to ignore it, I finally gave up and started climbing off trail toward the source of the sound. The terrain got rough fast. I was scrambling over fallen logs and pushing through thick underbrush, following that crying sound up a steep slope covered in loose rock. My boots kept slipping, and I had to grab onto tree branches to pull myself forward. The sound led me higher and higher until I was breathing hard and sweating despite the cool air. The elevation was getting to me. We were probably close to 4,000 feet by that point, and I could feel my lungs working overtime. My legs burned from the climb, and twice I nearly twisted my ankle on hidden roots beneath the leaf litter. Then, just when I thought I'd have to turn back before I broke an ankle, I saw it. A cave entrance partially hidden behind a massive fallen log and a thick tangle of brush. The opening was small, maybe 3 feet across, and if not for the crying coming from inside, I would have walked right past it 100 times without noticing. The log that partially blocked it looked ancient, covered in moss and decomposing into the forest floor. The brush around it was so thick I had to break branches to get close enough to peer inside. The sound was definitely coming from in there, weaker now, more sporadic, almost giving up. I hesitated at the entrance because going into an unknown cave is one of the stupidest things you can do in the wilderness. Could be a bear den, could be unstable, could collapse on me, could be anything. But those cries were getting quieter with each passing minute, and something told me if I didn't go in now, whatever was making that sound wasn't going to make it much longer. I pulled out my flashlight and got down on my hands and knees, calling out as I crawled forward to let any animals know I was coming. The tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic, the rock ceiling barely inches above my head. I could smell damp earth and something else, something musky and animal that I couldn't quite identify. My heart was pounding as I inched forward, ready to scramble backward at the first sign of danger. The cave opened up after about 6 feet of tunnel into a small chamber, maybe 8 feet across and 5 feet high. My flashlight beam swept across the space, illuminating rough stone walls and a floor covered in dry leaves and what looked like animal droppings. And there, huddled in the far corner, was something I still have trouble believing I actually saw. It was tiny, maybe 2 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown fur that was matted and dirty. At first, my brain tried to tell me it was a bear cub, desperately searching for a rational explanation, but the proportions were all wrong. It had long arms, almost comically long compared to its body and its face. God, its face was almost human. Not quite, but close enough to be deeply unsettling. Its eyes were enormous and dark, catching my flashlight beam and reflecting it back at me with this liquid, pleading expression. The skull was cone-shaped, different from any primate I'd seen in zoos or documentaries. When it saw me, it reached out with small, perfectly formed hands that had 5 fingers just like mine, the tiny digits grasping at empty air in a gesture so human it made my chest tight. I backed out of that cave so fast I nearly cracked my head on the rock ceiling. My heart was hammering and my hands were shaking as I crawled back into the open air. What I'd just seen couldn't exist. It didn't fit into any category my brain knew how to process. I've been hiking these mountains for 15 years, seen plenty of bears and mountain lions and elk and every kind of wildlife you can imagine. But nothing prepared me for that. Part of me wanted to run back to my truck and pretend I'd never seen it, drive home and convince myself it had been a hallucination brought on by altitude or dehydration. But that tiny creature reaching out to me with those 2 human hands kept playing in my mind, replaying over and over like a film loop I couldn't stop. I retreated about 200 yards down the slope and found a good spot behind a boulder outcropping where I could watch the cave entrance without being seen. I settled in behind the rocks, making myself as comfortable as possible on the hard ground. I told myself I'd wait for the mother to come back. Whatever that thing was, it had to have parents, and they'd return to take care of it. That made sense. That was logical. The sun was getting lower in the sky, painting the mountainside in that golden late afternoon light that makes everything look peaceful and safe. I kept scanning the tree line for movement, looking for any sign of a larger creature coming back to the cave. Birds called from the trees around me, completely oblivious to the impossibility hiding in that cave. A squirrel chittered somewhere behind me. Everything else was so normal, it made the whole situation feel even more surreal. Hours passed. The golden light faded to pink, then purple, then the deep blue of twilight. The temperature started dropping fast, the way it does in the mountains when the sun goes down. I'd guess it was in the low 30s by the time full darkness hit, maybe colder. My breath was visible in the air, little clouds of condensation that disappeared as fast as they formed. I could hear the infant's cries growing weaker and more sporadic. It would cry out every few minutes, then go silent for longer and longer periods. The sound echoed differently in the darkness, more hollow and desperate. I kept watching, kept waiting, but nothing came. No massive shape moving through the trees, no sound of approaching footsteps, nothing but the usual night sounds of the forest. I checked my watch repeatedly. 7 p.m., 8 p.m., 9 p.m. The temperature kept dropping. My fingers were getting numb despite my gloves. I stamped my feet quietly to keep circulation going, trying not to make enough noise to scare off whatever might be approaching. By midnight, the infant was barely making sounds at all, just occasional whimpers that broke my heart. The temperature had dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the moonlight, thick white clouds that hung in the still air. I'd been crouched behind that boulder for 7 hours, and I hadn't seen anything larger than a rabbit move through those trees. The mother wasn't coming back. Either she was dead or injured somewhere and unable to return, or, and this was the worst possibility, she had abandoned the infant deliberately. Maybe it was sick, maybe it was weak, maybe that's just what these creatures do when an infant can't keep up. I struggled with what to do for another hour, listening to those weak whimpers fade away to almost nothing. I thought about hiking out and trying to get help, but who would I call? The Forest Service? They'd think I was pranking them. Animal control? Same problem. The police? They'd probably send someone to check on my mental state. And tell them what? That I'd found a baby Bigfoot in a cave? They'd think I was crazy or drunk or both. By the time I convinced anyone to come back with me, if I could convince anyone at all, the infant would be dead from hypothermia. I'd seen animals die from exposure before. It's not quick and it's not peaceful. The thought of that tiny creature freezing to death alone in the dark was unbearable. Around 1 a.m, I made my decision. I grabbed my jacket and my water bottle and crawled back into that cave, using my flashlight to guide the way. The infant was still huddled in the corner, but it was barely moving now. Its breathing was shallow and rapid, little huffs that sounded wrong. When my flashlight hit it, those big eyes turned toward me with what looked like recognition. It didn't try to run or hide or defend itself. It just reached out those small hands again and made a weak, plaintive sound that cut right through me. The sound was so desperate, so trusting despite having no reason to trust me, that I knew I couldn't leave it there to die. I wrapped it in my jacket, and the moment the fabric touched it, the infant grabbed onto me with surprising strength. Even weak and cold as it was, its grip was incredibly powerful. The little fingers dug into the jacket material with a desperation that spoke of a last chance at survival. The little creature pressed itself against my chest, its tiny body shivering violently, and I could feel its heart beating rapid and desperate against me. It weighed almost nothing, felt fragile, as bird bones through the jacket. I backed out of the cave carefully, protecting the bundle with both arms, and started the long hike down to my truck, the infant hidden under my coat. It weighed maybe 15 pounds, light enough to carry easily, but the trail down in complete darkness was treacherous. I kept one arm wrapped around the bundle under my coat and used my free hand and the flashlight to navigate. The beam of light seemed tiny and inadequate, barely pushing back the darkness. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes made me jump, terrified that the mother would appear and rightfully tear me apart for taking her baby. I imagined an 8-foot creature charging out of the darkness, all teeth and claws and rage. My mind kept showing me scenarios where I didn't make it back to the truck, but the forest stayed quiet except for the usual night sounds, owls hooting in the distance, small animals moving through the undergrowth, wind sighing through the pine trees. The infant made small sound against my chest as I walked, weak little coos that gradually became less frequent as it used up what little energy it had left. I talked to it quietly as I hiked, just a steady stream of reassurance that I doubted understood but hoped might be comforting anyway. The trail seemed twice as long in the darkness, every landmark unfamiliar in the shadows. I nearly walked off the edge of a drop-off when my flashlight died unexpectedly, the batteries giving out at the worst possible moment. But I managed to catch myself and switch to my backup. My legs were shaking with exhaustion by the time I finally saw the glint of my truck's bumper reflecting in the flashlight beam. I reached my truck around 3 a.m. and carefully settled the infant in the passenger seat, still wrapped in my jacket. The bundle looked so small against the seat, barely visible. I turned the heat on full blast and started the long drive home, my mind racing the entire time. What was I going to do with this thing? What was I going to tell my wife? What would I feed it? How long could it even survive? The questions piled up faster than I could process them, but underneath all of them was a deeper certainty. I couldn't let this creature die, and I couldn't turn it over to anyone who might hurt it or lock it up in some government facility or laboratory. The drive took 2 hours on dark mountain roads, the infant occasionally making small sounds from the passenger seat. I kept glancing over, making sure it was still breathing, still hanging on. A few times its breathing got so shallow I thought I'd lost it, but then it would gasp and start again. The roads were completely empty at that hour, nothing but my headlights cutting through the darkness and the occasional eyes of animals reflecting from the shoulder. My wife was away visiting her mother for the week, which felt like providence. Some cosmic intervention giving me time to figure this out before having to explain the inexplicable. I pulled into our garage and closed the door before carrying the bundle inside. Our house sits on 5 acres at the edge of a small town with forest behind us, and our nearest neighbors about a 1/4 mile away. I'd always appreciated the privacy, but never more than at that moment. I took the infant straight down to the basement and set up a makeshift nest with old blankets and a heating pad set to low. Under the bright basement lights, I got my first really good look at what I'd brought home. The infant was definitely some kind of primate, but unlike anything I'd seen in zoos or documentaries, its fur was thick and shaggy, dark reddish-brown with lighter patches on its chest and face. The texture looked coarse, but somehow also soft, like it would be warm to touch. Its features were a disturbing mix of ape and human. A pronounced brow ridge that cast shadows over its eyes, a flattened nose with wide nostrils, but eyes that held an intelligence I'd never seen in an animal. The eyes were what got me. They weren't the blank, instinct-driven eyes of a bear cub or deer. They tracked my movements with purpose, with understanding, with something that looked like hope. Its hands and feet were perfectly formed with opposable thumbs and sensitive finger pads. The fingers were longer than a human infant's would be, more dexterous looking. When it grabbed my finger, the grip was gentle but incredibly strong, suggesting the power that would develop as it grew. I tried giving it water from a bottle, but it didn't seem to understand what to do with it. It would open its mouth when the bottle touched its lips, but then wouldn't suck or swallow. I was getting desperate, watching the infant grow weaker, its eyes starting to close more frequently. I'd read somewhere that orphaned animals often respond to milk. I mixed up some mashed banana with milk, making it thin enough to feed with a spoon, and the moment I touched it to the infant's lips, it started eating. Not gracefully, it was sloppy and messy, getting more on its face than in its mouth at first. But it was eating. It was hungry enough that it finished 3 bowls before finally seeming satisfied, its little belly visibly distended from the meal. That first week was terrifying and exhausting. I called in sick to work, claiming a bad flu, and spent every minute monitoring the infant in the basement. I barely slept, afraid I'd wake up to find it had died in the night. I set alarms to wake myself every 2 hours to check on it, to make sure it was still breathing, still warm enough. It slept most of the time those first few days, recovering from its ordeal, its tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm I found myself constantly checking. But when it was awake, it showed incredible curiosity and intelligence. It figured out how to climb before it could walk steady, scrambling up the basement stairs and clinging to the rafters with an ease that seemed impossible for something so young. Its grip strength was unbelievable. It could hang from a pipe for 20 minutes without seeming to tire, its little body swaying gently as it examined its surroundings from above. The infant grew attached to me fast, crying whenever I left the basement and calming down immediately when I returned. It would track me with its eyes as I moved around the room, making soft, cooing sounds when I looked at it. It followed me everywhere once it got stronger, this tiny ball of fur scrambling along behind me and making soft cooing sounds. If I went upstairs, it would climb after me. If I sat down, it would climb into my lap. The attachment was immediate and total, like I'd become its whole world. I started experimenting with different foods, and learned it preferred fruits, berries, and roots over anything else, though it would eat just about anything I offered. It loved apples especially, making happy grunting sounds as it gnawed on slices. The rate of growth was shocking. Within just a few weeks, it had doubled in size. By the end of the first month, it weighed at least 30 pounds and stood nearly 3 feet tall. When my wife came home, I had to tell her everything. She found me in the basement with this increasingly large creature climbing all over me, playing with my hair and making happy sounds. Her scream brought the infant scrambling down my body to hide behind my legs, peeking out at this new person with wide, frightened eyes. Her first reaction was pure horror. She backed away, demanding to know what that thing was and why it was in our house. She wanted to call the authorities immediately, convinced I'd kidnapped some kind of endangered species or broken a dozen laws. She was furious I hadn't told her, that I'd brought something potentially dangerous into our home without her knowledge. We argued for hours while the infant watched us with those intelligent eyes, making worried sounds whenever our voices got too loud. What finally convinced her was the infant itself. When it saw my wife was upset, it climbed down from my shoulders and approached her slowly, moving cautiously like it understood she was frightened. It reached out with one tiny hand, palm up, in a gesture that looked almost like an offering of peace. She backed away at first, terrified, but the infant just sat down and made this soft, pleading sound that was impossible to resist. The sound was so gentle, so non-threatening, so vulnerable that something in her expression shifted. When she finally let it touch her hand, it gently squeezed her fingers and looked up at her with those massive eyes, and I saw her expression change from fear to wonder. She picked it up carefully, expecting it to struggle or bite, but it immediately cuddled against her chest, making happy cooing sounds and grabbing gentle handfuls of her shirt. We spent the next week researching in secret, scouring the internet for any information that might help us understand what we were dealing with. There were plenty of Bigfoot stories, plenty of alleged sightings, grainy photos that could be anything, testimonials from people who swore they'd seen something in the woods, but nothing practical about care or feeding or what to do if you actually found one. No guides on Bigfoot husbandry, no veterinary advice for cryptids. We talked for hours about what to do, going through every possible option. Turn it over to wildlife authorities? They probably put it in a lab somewhere, run tests on it, maybe dissect it to see what made it tick. The thought made me sick. Call a zoo? Same problem. It would spend its life in a cage being studied, poked, and prodded and stared at by people who saw it as a curiosity rather than a living being. Neither of us could stomach that idea. Finally, we made our decision. We would raise it, but with one clear goal: prepare it to survive in the wild and eventually release it back into its natural habitat. The infant couldn't live with us forever, and it deserved to be free, to live as its species was meant to live. That decision changed everything. It meant we had to start thinking long-term, planning for a future where this creature could survive on its own. It meant teaching it skills it would need in the wild, not training it to be a pet. It meant accepting that we were temporary caretakers, not permanent parents, even though we were already falling in love with the strange little creature. The first major project was converting our detached garage into a proper living space. The basement had been fine when the infant was tiny, but it was growing at an incredible rate that shocked us daily. By the time it was 3 months old, it was the size of a 5-year-old human child and had the strength of a full-grown man. I watched it lift our coffee table with one hand, just picking it up like it weighed nothing, when it wanted to retrieve a ball that had rolled underneath. It could effortlessly lift furniture and had accidentally broken through drywall when playing too rough, leaving a hole the size of a dinner plate that I had to patch and repaint. The garage gave it more space and kept it separate from our main living area, which became necessary as it got bigger and stronger. We insulated the walls, installed heating, put in proper flooring. We spent thousands of dollars making it comfortable, turning it into what was essentially a studio apartment for a growing Bigfoot. We started taking it into our backyard at night, teaching it to climb the tall pine trees that bordered our property. It barely needed teaching. Climbing was instinctive. The first time I pointed at a tree, it scrambled up 30 feet in about 10 seconds, moving with a fluid grace that was beautiful to watch. Its movements were precise and confident, placing hands and feet in perfect positions without hesitation. It would spend hours in the branches, jumping from tree to tree with leaps that seemed impossible, building nests out of broken twigs and leaves that were actually quite sophisticated in construction. We had to be careful about timing, making sure our neighbors' lights were off, and no one was outside to see this increasingly large creature leaping through the treetops like something out of a nature documentary that shouldn't exist. The Bigfoot showed intelligence that consistently shocked us. It learned to open doors by watching us turn the handles, studying our movements, and then replicating them perfectly. Within a week, no door in our house was safe. It figured out how to work simple latches, sliding locks, even the child-proof cabinet locks we installed. It seemed to understand pointing and basic communication. If I pointed at something and said its name, the Bigfoot would go to that object. It knew which plants in our yard were edible and which to avoid, never once making a mistake despite having no one to teach it. The knowledge seemed hardwired, instinctive. When our neighbors' dogs would bark at night, drawn by the Bigfoot's scent, the Bigfoot would shrink back and hide, showing an instinctive fear that suggested its species and canines didn't get along. The fear was visceral and immediate, suggesting this was learned behavior passed down through generations. We had several close calls those first months. My brother stopped by unexpectedly one afternoon, knocking on the door while I was in the garage with the Bigfoot. We had to quickly hide the Bigfoot in the attic of the garage while we made awkward conversation at the front door, me sweating and nervous, making excuses about why he couldn't come in. The Bigfoot stayed perfectly silent the entire time, seeming to understand the need for secrecy. I could hear my brother asking if I was feeling all right, saying I looked stressed, and I had to laugh it off while my heart pounded. Another time, the mailman came around back to deliver a large package and caught a glimpse of something large and hairy moving in the garage window. We told him it was a costume for Halloween and laughed it off, but he looked suspicious, kept glancing back at the garage as he walked away. I'm sure he thought we were growing marijuana or hiding something illegal. When the Bigfoot was about 4 months old, we started taking it on pre-dawn hikes into the forest behind our property. We'd leave at 4 a.m. when the world was still dark and wouldn't return until after sunrise, carrying the Bigfoot in a large backpack if we encountered anyone. The Bigfoot was in its element in the woods, moving through the trees with a silence I couldn't match, even after 15 years of hiking. It would range ahead of us, then circle back, covering 3 times the distance we walked without seeming tired. Its endurance was incredible. It could climb, run, leap, and explore for hours without rest. During those early hikes, we watched it show abilities that seemed impossible. It could smell deer from what must have been a mile away, its nostrils flaring and its whole body going alert, pointing in the direction of the scent like a hunting dog. It would freeze completely still at the slightest sound, blending into the forest so perfectly that I'd lose sight of it, even though it was 20 feet away. The camouflage was natural and perfect. I could be looking right at where I knew it was standing and still not see it until it moved. The Bigfoot started teaching itself which plants were edible, pulling up roots and tasting leaves, somehow knowing instinctively what was safe and what wasn't. It would dig in specific places, finding tubers and grubs that I didn't even know were there. By the time it was a year old, the Bigfoot was the size of an adult human and stronger than any person I'd ever met. It stood about 5.5 feet tall and had to weigh at least 200 pounds of solid muscle. It could lift the riding lawnmower with one hand, actually picked it up to move it out of the way when it was blocking the garage door. It had accidentally ripped the door off the garage when it pulled too hard, yanking the entire door off its hinges with a casual tug. Its appetite was enormous. We were going through 50 pounds of produce every week, supplementing with roadkill deer and rabbits I'd pick up along the highways and store in a freezer in the garage. Our grocery bills were insane, and we had to make up stories about hosting large family gatherings to explain why we needed so much food. The cashiers at our local store started recognizing us, commenting on how much we love fruit. The neighbors started asking questions. Strange smells drifted from the garage, the musky animal scent that no amount of air freshener could completely hide. One neighbor swore she'd seen a large, hairy figure moving in our yard at night, standing upright like a person but too tall and too broad to be human. We told everyone we were caring for my wife's nephew, a boy with a rare genetic disorder that made him very large for his age and caused excessive hair growth. It was a terrible lie that made me feel awful every time I repeated it. But what else could we say? We even showed them a fake photo we'd doctored, a picture of a large teenager we'd found online and modified to look somewhat plausible. I hated lying to our neighbors, people we'd known for years. The incident with the neighbor's cat was our biggest scare yet. The Bigfoot had gotten out of the garage during the day while we were at work. We still don't know how it managed the locked door, though we suspect it had learned to pick simple locks by watching us. And by the time we got home, it had chased the neighbor's cat up a tree and was standing at the base, making interested grunting sounds and reaching up at the terrified feline. The neighbor was in her yard screaming, calling 911 on her phone, convinced some kind of monster was going to kill her pet. The Bigfoot heard us coming and climbed the tree with fluid grace, gently retrieved the cat by the scruff of its neck, the way a mother cat would carry a kitten, and brought it down unharmed. The cat was terrified but unhurt. The neighbor was too shocked to speak, standing frozen with her phone halfway to her ear. We grabbed the Bigfoot and hustled it back into the garage before she could get a good look, making soothing sounds and apologizing profusely. We told her it was our nephew having an episode, that his condition sometimes made him not understand social boundaries, and we were so sorry. She looked at us like we were insane, but she didn't call the police. That night, we made a serious decision. The Bigfoot was getting too big and too curious to keep hidden much longer. We needed to accelerate his wilderness training and start thinking seriously about when and how we'd release it. The thought broke my heart. I'd grown incredibly attached to this creature, loved it like it was my own child. But keeping it confined was wrong, and the risk of discovery was growing every day. If someone saw it clearly, if someone got a good photo, our whole carefully constructed life would fall apart. The Bigfoot would be taken away, probably killed in the process of capture, and we'd face criminal charges for harboring it. We started taking extended camping trips, leaving for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. We told our jobs we were dealing with family emergencies, sold it to our neighbors as helping sick relatives out of state. We'd drive deep into the Cascades to remote areas where we wouldn't see another person for weeks, where logging roads led to nowhere, and trails hadn't been maintained in years. We'd work on teaching the Bigfoot everything it needed to survive on its own, though increasingly we realized it already knew most of it. The Bigfoot took to wilderness living immediately. It would build elaborate shelters out of bent branches and woven leaves, structures that would keep out rain and wind perfectly. The construction was sophisticated, with angled roofs for water runoff and insulated walls. It learned to catch fish with its bare hands, standing patiently in streams until a trout swam close enough. then snatching it with lightning-fast reflexes that seemed impossible. We showed it how to dig for roots and find grubs under rotting logs, though it seemed to already know most of this instinctively. The knowledge was there, waiting to be awakened. I wondered if Bigfoot mothers normally taught these skills or if they were simply born knowing. During our second year together, we took a 3-week camping trip to a particularly remote area of wilderness, and the Bigfoot truly came into its own. It had grown to nearly 7 feet tall and had to weigh at least 400 pounds of solid muscle. Every movement showed power and grace. We encountered our first real test when a black bear wandered into our camp one evening, drawn by the smell of our food. The bear was huge, probably 500 pounds, confident and aggressive. The Bigfoot immediately put itself between us and the bear, standing up to its full height and making a sound I'd never heard before. A deep, resonant roar that seemed to vibrate the air itself. The sound was primal and terrifying, resonating in my chest like a physical force. Birds exploded from nearby trees. The bear, which probably outweighed the Bigfoot by 100 pounds, took one look at this massive, upright creature making sounds from nightmares and turned around and fled. It crashed through the underbrush so fast it nearly tripped over its own feet. I realized in that moment that the Bigfoot wasn't just surviving in the wild, it was thriving. It was an apex predator, the top of the food chain, feared by creatures that feared nothing else. The Bigfoot's vocalizations were becoming more complex and varied. It could perfectly mimic bird calls, copying the exact rhythm and tone of robins, jays, even the complex songs of thrushes. It could imitate elk bugles with such accuracy that we heard real elk responding, even the sound of wind through the trees. Sometimes at night, it would sit at the edge of our camp and make long, complex sounds that seemed almost like language. Patterns of hoots and whistles and low thrumming sounds that felt like they should mean something. The sounds had structure, rhythm, variation. I wondered if it was calling out to others of its kind, hoping for an answer that never came. The sounds were mournful and lonely, making me ache for this creature that might be the last of its kind. We discovered it had started making crude tools. It would sharpen sticks for digging up roots, grinding them against rocks until they had proper points. It would use rocks to crack open nuts, selecting specific stones for specific purposes. And it would fashion simple scrapers from flat stones, shaping them by chipping away edges until they had a good edge for scraping hides or processing plant materials. It would watch us use our camping tools and then create its own versions, simplified but functional. The intelligence was obvious and sometimes frightening. This wasn't just a smart animal, it was something else entirely. Something that existed in the gray area between animal and human. By the time the Bigfoot was 3 years old, we decided it was time to test its skills in its original territory. We drove back to the Cascades near where I'd found it, parked at that same trailhead where this whole journey had begun, and hiked up to the area near the cave. The Bigfoot moved through those mountains like it had never left, confidently navigating terrain that would have killed a human who didn't know it. It seemed to remember the place, stopping occasionally to examine landmarks, touching trees with what looked like recognition. We encountered hunters on that trip, which terrified me. I heard their voices from a distance, carried on the wind, and my heart stopped. The Bigfoot heard them long before I did, freezing in place and then melting into the forest so completely that even though I was looking right at it, I lost sight of where it went. 2 hunters walked within 10 feet of where the Bigfoot was hiding, rifles over their shoulders, completely oblivious. They were talking about Bigfoot sightings in the area, joking about people who believed in such nonsense, while the real thing stood invisible and silent in the brush 20 feet away. One hunter stopped right next to where I thought the Bigfoot was hiding, so close I was sure he'd see it, but he just looked around and kept walking. The second hunter encounter didn't go as smoothly. One of them caught a glimpse of the Bigfoot silhouette through the trees, just a shadow, just a shape that shouldn't be there, and raised his rifle. The Bigfoot moved faster than I thought anything that large could move, closing the distance in seconds and swatting the rifle aside so hard it flew 30 feet through the air and clattered against a tree. The hunter stumbled backward and fell, scrambling away on his hands and feet. Then the Bigfoot turned and ran, disappearing into the forest at a speed I couldn't follow even with my eyes. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. The hunter was left standing there in shock, and I heard him later describing an 8-foot monster with glowing eyes to his companion, his voice shaking. They reported it to the local authorities when they got back to civilization, filing an official report that I read about online later. That sighting made the news. Local stations ran stories about renewed Bigfoot activity in the Cascades, interviewing the hunter who sounded genuinely traumatized by what he'd seen. They brought in experts to analyze his story, showed maps of previous sighting locations, created graphics of possible Bigfoot habitats. We had to keep the Bigfoot hidden at home for 2 months afterward while the area was crawling with curiosity seekers and amateur researchers, people with cameras and camping equipment hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious creature. The Bigfoot grew restless and agitated during that time, clearly unhappy being confined after tasting freedom in the wild. It would pace the garage for hours, making frustrated sounds. The next few years became a pattern. Hide the Bigfoot when discovery seemed likely, take it deep into the wilderness when it was safe, gradually teaching it to be more careful around humans. We focused especially on teaching it to recognize human sounds from great distances and to always stay hidden. The Bigfoot learned these lessons well, developing an almost supernatural ability to detect humans long before they could see it. It could hear voices from what must have been miles away, its ears swiveling to track sounds I couldn't detect. We'd take it to areas with hiking trails and practice avoidance. The Bigfoot would parallel track hikers, following them through the forest from a distance while staying completely invisible. It showed incredible patience, capable of remaining frozen in place for hours if necessary, barely breathing, muscles locked in stillness that would have been agonizing for a human. It learned to recognize the specific sounds of trail cameras, the faint mechanical whir when they activated, and would either avoid them completely or, disturbingly, would sometimes deliberately remove them from trees and destroy them. We'd find crushed cameras left in piles, smashed beyond recognition. When the Bigfoot was about 6 years old, we had another major scare. A game warden found unusual tracks on our property while investigating reports of illegal deer hunting in the area. He took photographs with a camera that had measurement references, collected plaster casts, and even collected hair samples from where the Bigfoot had rubbed against our fence. We got a very official-looking letter a month later saying the DNA analysis had come back as unknown primate, and that an investigation had been opened into possible illegal exotic animal possession. The letter detailed potential fines and even jail time for harboring protected species without permits. We panicked and moved the Bigfoot to a different forest 100 miles away, setting it up in a temporary camp while we dealt with the authorities. We claimed we'd been seeing the same tracks, that something wild was raiding our property, and we were as confused as they were. We played the role of concerned homeowners, asking what we should do about this mysterious animal. The investigation eventually went nowhere. Without being able to produce an actual animal, they couldn't prove anything. But it was a close call that aged me 10 years and a few weeks. I developed an ulcer from the stress, barely slept, jumped at every unexpected knock on the door. The Bigfoot struggled with the separation. Even though we visited every week, bringing food and supplies, it was clearly unhappy. We'd arrived to find it had destroyed its shelter in frustration, broken branches, and scattered leaves everywhere. On our third week, we arrived to find it had traveled over 30 miles trying to get back home, navigating terrain that should have been impossible in the dark. We tracked it through difficult country, following distinctive prints and territorial markings. The intelligence and determination in that act was both impressive and heartbreaking. It wanted to come home, wanted to be with us, but we couldn't risk bringing it back while investigators might still be watching our property. When the investigation finally closed and the trail cameras were removed from our original forest, we were able to retrieve the Bigfoot permanently. But the close call had taught us an important lesson. We couldn't keep it indefinitely. The Bigfoot was nearly 8 feet tall now, easily 600 pounds, and too large and too smart to hide for much longer. We needed to start thinking seriously about permanent release. The thought was devastating. We'd had nearly 7 years with this creature, watched it grow from a helpless infant to a powerful adult, and the idea of saying goodbye was almost unbearable. We bought a large piece of rural property in an extremely remote area and built what looked like a hunting cabin, but was really a large, secure enclosure for the Bigfoot. The property was accessible only by a logging road that washed out half the year, surrounded by millions of acres of wilderness. It was there that we noticed the changes that signaled approaching maturity. The Bigfoot began marking territory, rubbing against trees until the bark was stripped away, breaking branches in specific patterns that looked like messages. Its behavior grew more independent and sometimes aggressive, especially around food. It would snarl if we got too close while it was eating, a clear warning to back off. One day when I interrupted it during a meal, trying to add more food to its pile, it actually snarled at me and pushed me away, baring teeth that could easily tear me apart. The shove was hard enough to knock me down, though I could tell it was holding back. These weren't signs of the Bigfoot turning mean or dangerous. They were signs of it becoming an adult, establishing boundaries, developing its own identity separate from us. It was exactly what we'd hoped for, what we'd worked toward, even though it hurt to see that psychological distance growing between us and this creature we'd raised from infancy. The Bigfoot that had once followed us everywhere, that had climbed into our laps seeking comfort, was becoming something wild and independent. We started preparing for the final release when the Bigfoot was about 10 years old. We took it on longer and longer wilderness trips, each time staying in more remote areas and leaving it alone for longer periods. We'd set up base camps but give the Bigfoot freedom to roam, sometimes not seeing it for days at a time. During one memorable trip, we watched from a distance as the Bigfoot successfully hunted and killed a deer on its own for the first time. It was patient and strategic, waiting near a game trail for over 2 hours. Completely motionless, barely breathing, when a doe came close enough, it moved with explosive speed, covering the distance in seconds and breaking the deer's neck with a single twist. The kill was quick and efficient, and the Bigfoot knew instinctively how to butcher and eat its prey, tearing through hide and extracting the most nutritious organs first. I had conflicting emotions watching that. Pride in the Bigfoot's skills and accomplishment, seeing the culmination of everything we'd taught it and everything it had taught itself. Sadness that it was becoming independent and would soon leave us, that our role in its life was ending. Fear that we were getting closer to the moment we'd have to say goodbye forever. The Bigfoot looked different after that first hunt, more confident, more adult, like it had passed some crucial test of maturity and proven to itself that it could survive alone. It started marking territory aggressively, rubbing against trees until the bark was stripped away in patches 6 feet wide, breaking branches as high as it could reach in distinctive patterns that seemed to convey meaning. The markings were systematic and intentional, placed at regular intervals along trails. One time when I tried to interrupt this behavior, curious about what it was doing, it shoved me away with enough force that I fell and hit my head on a rock. I saw stars, tasted blood where I'd bitten my tongue. It wasn't trying to hurt me, just establishing boundaries, but the message was clear. The Bigfoot was ready to be on its own, and I was no longer the dominant figure in its life. We gradually spent less time with it, letting it get used to longer periods of independence. Where we used to visit daily, we started visiting weekly, then every other week. The Bigfoot would range farther from our camp during these visits, sometimes disappearing for days before returning. We'd find evidence of its activities scattered through the forest. Deer kills with systematic butchering, fish bones scattered near streams, elaborate shelters it had constructed in temporary camps scattered across miles of territory. Each shelter showed increasing sophistication in design and construction. We found the perfect location for final release when the Bigfoot was 12 years old. A massive wilderness area in the northern Cascades, over 50 miles from the nearest town and rarely visited by humans. The terrain was perfect Bigfoot habitat, dense forest with massive old-growth trees, plenty of streams and rivers teeming with fish, abundant wildlife including deer and elk, countless caves and rock formations for shelter. We set up a base camp on a ridge overlooking a pristine valley and started bringing the Bigfoot there for extended stays. At first, we'd visit every few weeks with supplies, making sure it was doing okay, worried it might struggle in this new territory. But the Bigfoot needed us less and less. It adapted quickly, claiming the valley as its own. It would be gone for days when we arrived, and we'd have to track it down using the patterns it left. Broken branches marking trails, distinctive footprints in the soft earth near streams, territorial markings on trees. When we did find it, the Bigfoot seemed almost surprised to see us, like we were interrupting its routine rather than being a central part of its life. Sometimes it seemed almost annoyed by our presence. I set up a hidden observation post on a ridge overlooking the valley where the Bigfoot had established its core territory. I built a small blind using natural materials, completely invisible from below. I could sit there with a spotting scope and watch it go about its daily life from half a mile away without disturbing it. I spent weeks up there during that first year after release, just watching, making sure it was thriving, unable to completely let go. And it was. The Bigfoot had claimed a large territory, probably 20 square miles, and was clearly the dominant presence in that entire valley. Nothing challenged it. Even the bears gave it a wide berth. We had one more close call during this period. A group of backpackers set up camp right in the middle of the Bigfoot's territory, apparently drawn by the pristine valley and good fishing. 5 of them with expensive gear and cameras everywhere. I watched anxiously through my scope as the Bigfoot observed them from the tree line. It had learned its lessons well. It stayed hidden, watched them carefully, only moved when they were asleep or far away. I saw it approach their camp one night after they'd gone to sleep, moving like a ghost through the darkness. It stood at the edge of their camp, just watching them breathe in their tents, curious but cautious. After 2 days, the backpackers packed up and left, never knowing they'd been observed the entire time by something they probably didn't believe existed. One of them even commented on what great wildlife viewing they'd had, completely unaware of the apex predator that had been watching them. When the Bigfoot was about 15 years old, everything changed. I started finding tracks in the valley that didn't belong to the Bigfoot I'd raised. These tracks were larger, with a different stride pattern and different pressure points, suggesting an even bigger individual. I found tree markings and twisted branches in patterns that looked like territorial claims, different from the patterns my Bigfoot made. My Bigfoot started leaving its territory for longer and longer periods, sometimes disappearing for weeks at a time. I would watch from my observation post and see the valley empty, no sign of the creature I'd raised. I set up trail cameras in some strategic locations and eventually captured blurry footage of another Bigfoot, possibly female based on size and build, though I couldn't be certain. The figure was massive, but moved with a different gait, more fluid and graceful. My Bigfoot started coming back from these extended trips with injuries. Deep scratches across its shoulders that must have been agonizing, bite marks on its arms that showed the distinct pattern of large teeth, clear signs of fighting. My instinct was to intervene, to help it, to clean wounds and apply medicine, but I forced myself to stay away and observe. This was part of wild Bigfoot life, establishing dominance, competing for territory and mates. If I interfered, I'd be undermining everything we'd worked for. The Bigfoot healed from these injuries with remarkable speed that seemed impossible. What would put a human in the hospital for weeks, what would require surgery and months of recovery, would heal on the Bigfoot in days, leaving barely a scar. I watched through my scope as it tended its own wounds, using leaves and mud as what looked like deliberate poultices, mixing specific plants with water to create pastes it applied to injuries. The intelligence required for that kind of self-care was stunning. It knew which plants had medicinal properties, knew how to combine them, knew how to treat itself. The camera captured something even more remarkable when the Bigfoot was 17, footage of my Bigfoot and another smaller Bigfoot together. They weren't fighting. They were moving together through the forest, occasionally touching each other's hands or shoulders in gestures that looked affectionate. I watched this happen from my observation post too, seeing my Bigfoot with what I desperately hoped was a mate. They moved in sync, communicating through sounds and gestures I couldn't interpret. They shared food, groomed each other, built shelters together. It was everything I'd hoped for. The Bigfoot had found others of its kind. That was when I knew it was time to truly let go. The Bigfoot didn't need me anymore. It had found its place in the world, found companionship of its own kind. I started visiting less frequently, usually just hiking to my observation point and watching from a distance. Sometimes I wouldn't see the Bigfoot for months, and I'd wonder if it had moved territories, if it was still alive. But I'd find evidence that it was still there, still thriving. Massive tracks in the mud near streams, fresh territorial markings, remains of kills left at regular feeding sites. The valley had become home to what I increasingly suspected was a small family group of Bigfoots. One evening when I was watching from my ridge, almost ready to give up and accept I'd never see the Bigfoot again, I saw it emerge from the tree line accompanied by a smaller figure. My heart nearly stopped when I realized what I was seeing. The smaller Bigfoot was carrying something, and as they got closer to a stream, I could see through my scope that it was an infant. The tiny creature was maybe 2 feet tall, covered in dark fur that looked almost black in the fading light and playing in the shallow water while the adult Bigfoots watched. It would splash and tumble, rolling in the water like an otter, making sounds I could hear echoing across the valley, joyful, playful sounds. I stayed frozen behind my spotting scope, barely breathing, my hands shaking so badly I had trouble keeping the image steady as I watched the Bigfoot I'd raised teaching this infant how to catch fish. The tiny creature would lunge at the water with both hands and fall flat on its face, splashing and flailing in a way that would have been comical if it wasn't so achingly familiar. I'd watched the Bigfoot I raised do the exact same thing 15 years ago. While the adults watched patiently, offering gentle guidance through touches and sounds, the infant tried again and again, determined despite repeated failures. Then the big Bigfoot would demonstrate, standing perfectly still as a statue before snatching a fish with lightning speed. The infant watched, fascinated, learning. This was how knowledge passed between generations. Suddenly, without any obvious trigger, the Bigfoot I'd raised turned and looked directly at me, even though I was half a mile away, hidden in a blind, completely concealed. Those eyes that I'd first seen in a cave 18 years ago, huge and dark and liquid, locked onto mine across the distance, and I knew it recognized me. It knew I was there. Had probably known I'd been watching for weeks. Those eyes held intelligence and recognition, and something that might have been gratitude. It made a long, low vocalization that carried across the valley, a sound that was almost mournful, but also seemed like acknowledgement or farewell. The sound resonated in my chest, made my eyes burn with tears I'd been holding back for months. I raised my hand through blurred vision, a simple wave that we'd shared 1,000 times during our years together. The Bigfoot raised one massive arm in return, mimicking the gesture I'd taught it so long ago when it was small enough to fit in my arms. The movement was deliberate and clear, unmistakable in its meaning. We stayed like that for a long moment, separated by distance and divergent lives, but connected by shared history that nothing could erase. Then the Bigfoot turned back to the infant and the other adult, and the three of them disappeared into the forest, melting into the shadows between the trees until they were gone completely. I packed up my observation post that night with hands that shook and eyes that wouldn't stop tearing. I hiked back to my truck in darkness, stumbling more than once, not caring. I knew I'd never see the Bigfoot again, and that was how it should be. That was the gift I'd given it. Freedom. The creature I'd found crying in a cave, cold and alone and dying, had survived against all odds. It had grown into a powerful adult, had found others of its kind, and was now raising young of its own. I'd given it the greatest gift I could, freedom to live as its species was meant to live, hidden and safe from a world that would destroy it without meaning to. That was 3 years ago now. I still drive up to those mountains sometimes, still hike the trails near the territory on weekends when I can get away, but I never go into the valley anymore. I don't want to disturb what's growing there, don't want my presence to interfere with the life the Bigfoot has built. Sometimes I find evidence that might be from my Bigfoot, tracks that are the right size with the distinctive pressure pattern I remember, territorial markings at the right height for its reach. But I can never be sure. There could be several Bigfoots in that valley now. I hear occasional news reports of Bigfoot sightings in the area, amateur researchers posting grainy videos online, and I smile knowing at least some of those sightings are probably real. Some of those massive shapes caught on trail cameras are creatures I helped save. I keep detailed journals and a few photographs hidden in a safety deposit box at a bank 3 towns over. Hundreds of pages documenting everything, the discovery, the early days, the growth, the training, the release. My wife and I never talk about those 20 years with anyone else. We can't. How could we? Who would believe us? And even if they did believe us, what would happen to the Bigfoots? The valley would be overrun with researchers and curiosity seekers and hunters and people with cameras. The Bigfoots would be tracked and studied and eventually caught, tagged, collared, their DNA sampled. Everything I worked for would be destroyed. The freedom I'd fought so hard to give them would be taken away. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice, taking that infant from the cave instead of leaving it for nature to decide its fate. What if the mother had come back? What if my intervention disrupted some natural process? But then I remember watching it play with its own infant in that stream, remember the acknowledgement in its eyes when it saw me on the ridge, and I know I gave it a chance at life it wouldn't have had otherwise. Without my intervention, it would have frozen to death in that cave before dawn. 20 years of my life went into protecting a species that most people think is just a myth or a joke or a man in a costume. I've never told anyone the story until now, and I probably shouldn't have told you either. But I'm getting older, 52 now, with gray in my hair and knees that don't work like they used to. And I needed someone to know what really happened, to understand that they're out there, they're real, and they deserve to be left alone to live in peace. If you ever hear about Bigfoot sightings in the northern Cascades, just remember there might be more truth to those stories than anyone realizes. I find peace in knowing the Bigfoot is alive somewhere in those mountains, probably teaching its own young how to fish and hunt and stay hidden from the humans who would destroy their world without meaning to. That infant that reached out to me with tiny, desperate hands in a dark cave 23 years ago has become part of a family, part of a hidden population that survived in those mountains for who knows how long. Maybe they've been there for thousands of years, living in the gaps and shadows where humans don't look, adapting and surviving and raising their young in secret. Sometimes on quiet nights, I imagine I can hear vocalizations echoing off distant mountains. Long, mournful calls that might be Bigfoots communicating across the darkness. Complex sounds that might be language, might be songs, might be stories being passed down from parent to child the way humans tell stories around campfires. I'll never know if one of those calls belongs to the creature I raised, but I like to think it does. I like to think it remembers those years we spent together, remembers the human who found it and raised it and loved it enough to let it go. I hope it tells its offspring about that time, passes down the knowledge that not all humans are dangerous, that some of us can be trusted. The sun sets over those mountains every evening, painting them in shades of gold and purple and deep blue that make them look like something from a painting. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, hidden in places humans rarely venture, a family of Bigfoots is settling in for the night. Maybe building shelters from branches and leaves, maybe sharing food they've gathered during the day, maybe teaching their young the skills they need to survive in a world that doesn't believe they exist. And I'm okay with that. More than okay. I'm grateful I got to play a part in their survival, even if no one will ever know about it but me and you and my wife. That's my story. That's what happened when I found a lone Bigfoot infant in a hidden cave and raised it for 20 years before returning it to the wild. Make of it what you will. Believe it or don't. Call me crazy if you want. But sometimes, on those quiet nights when I hear sounds echoing from the distant mountains, I know the truth. And that's enough for me. For more interesting stories, check this out.